Hi everyone, this is Matthew Jennifer Card Runners, and I'm here with the theory of advanced bet sizing, part 1. I just started paleo, so I'm going to be eating some carrots. I assume that's not a big deal. Most people tend to like my videos. I figure they won't really care. So just know there's going to be a little bit of crunching in the background. I'm just kidding with you guys. Well, unfortunately, bet sizing is no joking matter. Welcome to the toughest theory series I've yet to do and probably will ever do. Just about everyone sucks at bet sizing. Even world-class players are likely constantly making large bet sizing mistakes since bet sizing is so hard. You could guess whether to bet or check in the limit and have a 50% chance of being right. You can guess whether to call, fold, or check raise in limit when facing a bet and have a 33.3% chance of being right. There's just not that many decisions to make when you're playing a limit game. How about with bet sizing? What if you have the ability to bet between 0 and 1.5 pot size bets on the river? What are your odds of guessing right here? Now really think about this for a minute, because one thing I notice a lot when I talk to other players is bet sizing is such a hard topic and something people don't really understand well at all, that really when they're debating whether or not to bet, they're usually asking themselves, do I want to make a standard size bet here or do I want to check? When was the last time you bet 0.2 pot size bets on the river? Because it makes a lot of sense to make a bet like that, especially when you're out of position. Probably you don't even run that option through your mind because you're playing a bunch of tables. You're trying to just, play poker better than everyone else, playing the same way everyone else kind of plays. So you're making the same bet sizing and you're just playing the way everyone else does. But really, we're going to see that stuff's definitely an option. So it's very hard to pinpoint the exact bet sizing unless you have a very, very strong thought process. Otherwise, you're kind of just guessing and betting what everyone else does. We will go from broader and simpler concepts to more detailed and difficult ones. This is a series where I will have to express my thought process and give my opinion more than most. It's harder to model bet sizing situations and impossible to get very precise solutions in general unless we're on the river. So I've talked about that in other videos, how usually you can model things very well when you're on the river, but when you start talking about the turn or the flop, or especially even pre-flop, it gets much harder to get precise solutions from formulas. You more have to sort of set parameters and make your best guess. We're definitely going to have to do that here when we're talking about bet sizing on the flop and the turn. Not so much for the river, but at least on the flop and the turn, so be aware of that. Just to give an example of how tricky bet sizing can be, I would say in general, the better the player I'm talking to when they ask me a question, the more likely the question they're asking me is going to be a bet sizing question. If I'm talking with someone that plays very, very low limits, they're relatively new to poker, or they're just playing poker as a hobby, the question will usually be what line should I take? What do I do here? Does this make sense? Whereas if I'm talking with a really, really good player, they probably know what line they want to take, and now they just want help pinpointing the bet sizing. So something that's very interesting to think about as you approach this series, bet sizing, if you're playing, reasonably high stakes, like you're playing for a living, then you're probably going to really want to focus on bet sizing. It's probably a huge area of your game that you can improve. If you're playing very, very low stakes, then you probably don't want to focus too much on bet sizing because it's difficult. And if you're just, betting normal sizing and taking the right line at a high frequency, you're going to be able to beat your opponents. So just be aware of that before going in. So, outline for the series. First off, we're going to start off doing basic bet sizing theory. Some of this will be a repeat of what I already explained in the first series a few years ago, but it should be explained much more clearly with better examples now. You can probably skip the first video if you are already pretty comfortable with the very basic bet sizing theory and have seen the old series. This series will get tough, but the first video will not be too difficult. I understand bet sizing way better than I did in the past, but the first video isn't going to be too difficult. It's meant to really help people that haven't seen the old series, or if you saw the old series a long time ago, you've probably gotten a lot better. I've probably gotten a lot better since then. So this will sort of lead us into the more difficult concepts. Then we're going to go into advanced bet sizing theory. We're going to focus on how the polarization of each range determines the bet sizing on each street. Not all equity is created equally, and what type of equity we have will determine when we want to bet and how much we want to bet. So, I've talked about that a lot in other videos, how you can't look at equity as it's some fixed quality. Some equity is really, really good, some equity is not really that useful. What type of equity we have is largely going to determine how much we bet. Then we're going to get into balancing multiple bet sizing ranges in the same spot. So one mistake a lot of people have right now is they think you're supposed to use one bet sizing in every situation. The better you get, the more bet sizings you're going to use in the same situation. And by the same situation, I don't mean you adjust your bet sizing based on the flop texture. I mean, on a given flop texture, you can have 3 different ranges which all use a different bet sizing. Then we're going to go over some conceptual examples, randomly generated Flopzilla examples, as well as your submitted bet sizing questions. Sorry for shouting there. But I want you to be able to submit your own questions, and I want to be able to randomly generate hands in Flopzilla the way that I've done in the past. I think that's really useful for getting to see sort of a lot of spots, a lot of board textures very quickly as you're sort of conceptually applying the theory. So I'll probably spend one video doing that. And then I want to go over analytical examples, which will be using formulas and Flopzilla to try to pinpoint more precise sizing away from the tables. So part of the difficulty in bet sizing is it really lets you manipulate your opponent's range well. If you bet big, your opponent's going to fold a lot and felt a very strong range, but the pot's going to be huge. If you bet small, your opponent's going to felt a wide range, the pot's going to be small, but his range is going to be weak. We can really manipulate the opponent's range effectively based on what hand we have by the sizing we choose to use. So conceptually, we'll go over all that stuff first, then we're going to actually start generating flops and trying to think, okay, well, how do we pinpoint our sizing here if we want to make our opponent call down with mostly middle pair? So now we're going to start off with basic bet sizing theory, and once again, feel free to skip this if you feel like you already probably know this stuff. Let's start out with the most useful bet sizing theory I've come across from Mathematics of Poker by Bill Chen and Jared Inkenman. We want to bet an equal fraction of the pot on each street when we have a perfectly polarized range that allows us to get all the money in the pot by the river. So an equal fraction of the pot where we're felting all in by the river. This is summarized on page 248 of the book, and probably the single most valuable piece of information I found in the book. And then a quick plug for the book. While this book is a pretty tough read, anyone very interested in poker theory will likely greatly enjoy this book. In my opinion, it's probably the most advanced poker book ever written by a very wide margin, and it's not something that you can just read and immediately apply it without thinking, but it is, in my opinion, also the most impressive poker book ever written, at least of all the poker books I've read. Deriving this solution requires calculus and a very strong understanding of math. This sizing structure maximizes the amount the better wins. While we get less folds than other bet sizing structures, we maximize how much we overall win. And that's what we care about. So don't worry if you don't completely understand why this rule works, or if you don't understand how it was derived. Most people don't. But you can understand how if you have a range of nuts and air, you want to get all the money in by the river by betting an equal fraction on each street. An equal fraction of the pot on each street. For example, just jamming on the flop will get more folds if we risk $100 to win $10, since the opponent can fold over 90% of the time, since we risk so much to win the pot. Yet we'll win a lot more if we bet the flop in turn and make the opponent fold the river, because now when our opponent folds on the river, we've built up the pot. So, once again, it's a little bit complicated to derive this, but this is the most mathematically effective way to bet when you have a polarized range. Equal fractions on each street continued. A clairvoyant game means a player has complete information. This is the same thing as a perfectly polarized range in practice and what I will almost always refer to. A perfectly polarized range means one player has the range of nuts and air, so he always knows when he has the best hand, whereas the player with the medium strength range never really knows because he always looks down and sees a medium strength hand and he doesn't know what the opponent's holding. This illustrates why equity is not created equally. If a player has a range which is 40% the pure nuts and 60% air, how much equity does his range have? Think about this for a minute. How much equity does a range have if it has 40% the pure nuts and 60% pure air? 0.4 times 100% plus 0.6 times 0% equals 40%. So if you were to plug in that range to PokerStove, it would tell you your range has 40% equity, which doesn't look that good. Perfectly polarized ranges continued. But which range is better? The range with 40% equity in a perfectly polarized range, or the range with 60% equity in a condensed or only marginal strength range? So the term I like to use for a range that is the opposite of polarized, it only has mostly, bluff catching hands, medium strength hands, is a condensed range. So which range is better? One equity has a better distribution of equity. It has the nuts in the air, whereas the other range has overall more equity. And this is a question we're going to constantly be asking ourselves. It's a very important question. How do you deal with the fact that one range has a better distribution of equity? It has more nutted hands and more air hands, which are easier and more effective to play. Yet the other range has overall more equity. Who decides what happens? So think about this for a minute. What do you think, in your opinion, is better? A range that has 40% equity but a great distribution of equity, or a range that has 60% equity but a poor distribution of equity? Think about it for a minute. It depends. Which variables are most important? Streets left to act, stack depth. That's talked about nonstop in my other videos. This determines pretty much how big of a deal having a polarized range is. And in reality, the 40% polarized range, the 40% equity polarized range will almost always be better unless stacks are really shallow and we're on the river. So mathematically, having your equity distributed well is a huge deal. Another question that I ask pretty often is, does position matter at all when one range is perfectly polarized? You might have already seen me talk about this in another video, but the answer is nope. The condensed range never bets, and the perfectly polarized range bets at the exact frequency on each street to make the opponent indifferent to calling or folding when facing a bet. So as a range gets more polarized, position starts to matter less. Just think about that conceptually, apply it for just a moment. Is position usually a big deal on a king 3-3 rainbow board, where a betting range is usually either way ahead or way behind? Or is position usually a big deal on a board that's like 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts, 7 of clubs? Of course, position is much more valuable on a 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts, 7 of clubs board. Now, you might not really understand exactly why. It's going to be very important as we pick bet sizing, but you might not really understand exactly why, but think about that. In one of those ranges, a betting range is going to play very, very polarized. It's either going to be nuts or air on a king 3-3 board or very close to it. And then on a 10-9-7 board, pretty much hands are going to be, bluffs are going to be improving, or strong hands are going to get drawn out all the time, and that makes position very, very valuable. Now I want to talk a bit more about polarization, especially with regards to the equity of a range. I know a lot of people hate the term polarization, but it is seriously probably one of the most useful and important terms in poker. The better the player is I'm talking to, the more likely this term is usually to come up. As stated under videos, the three things I look at when beginning to analyze a hand are, first, the overall equity of each range. In general, if a range has more equity, that's a good thing. But when you look at the overall equity of each range, it doesn't tell you how useful that equity is. Not all equity is created equally. Some equity is a lot better than others. So if you just look at the overall equity of each range, that's not telling you the whole story. Nevertheless, it is something that is useful to look at a glance. Then the polarization of equity. Is one range mostly condensed, which means it only consists of bluff catchers, while the other range has many strong and weak hands, meaning it's polarized? If it is, that's hugely significant. And then the last thing I look at is the value of position. The value of position itself is greatly determined on how the equity in each range is distributed. Remember, if one range is perfectly polarized, position does not matter. So if one range is all nuts and air and the other is all bluff catchers, position doesn't mean a thing. Both step 2 and 3 depend on the distribution or polarization of equity. This is an absolutely massive deal. It is harder to analyze and much more important than absolute equity of each range, which is probably why people often ignore it and mistakenly think the term is overused. So if I were to go read some random threads that people post on in 2+2, all the time you'll see people that will post the range each player has on a board texture and show the overall equity, and they use it all the time to try to win an argument when that's not really what's that relevant. Yes, it's good to know how much equity each range has, but unless I know how that equity is distributed, it's really not that strong of an argument for betting or checking or check raising or what. You have to know how the equity is distributed. So when I use this thought, or when I analyze these three aspects of a hand right here, so the overall equity of each range, the polarization of equity, and the value of position, the absolute equity in each range is probably the least important one. It's still something that's good to look at a glance. It will often tell you something like, oh, if I have this much equity on a king-high board, I am not calling enough kings pre-flop, or I'm calling too many kings pre-flop. And based on that, you can maybe determine if you should check or bet. But for the most part, we really care about how that equity is distributed. Does one range have more nutted hands than the other? Do both have a similar amount? And that's going to determine how much we can bet, what sort of bet sizing we use. And as I also am going to talk about a lot in this series, a lot of times we're going to have multiple bet sizings in the same spot, and that's going to depend on how the equity is distributed. So make sure you understand this before moving on. Examples of perfectly polarized ranges. A range can consist of hands which have 100% or 0% equity, but they are rare. Can you think of an example? So we want to train our brains to think better, so pause for a moment and think of an example where your range is perfectly polarized. One example would be on the river when you are betting pure nuts or pure air. For example, if you are betting a range of nut flushes and air with the nut flush blocker on the river. So, this is not some abstract concept. This actually happens sometimes, and when it does, it models perfectly when we have a perfectly polarized range. River is a great example. What bet sizing should you use on the river if you are jamming either ace x of hearts, or ace of hearts king x, or ace of hearts queen x on a jack of heart, 10 of heart, 4 of clubs, 2 of spades, 6 of hearts board? So what bet sizing do you want when you are jamming a range on the river that's either pure nuts or pure air? You want to go all in. Remember, we want to get all the money in by betting equal fractions of the pot on each street. Here, since we have only one street left, the only way we can get all the money in is by jamming. So once again, this is a spot where all the theory works perfectly because we have a perfectly polarized range. As our range gets less polarized, theory will not work so perfectly. This should intuitively make sense if it doesn't stop for a while and think about it. Multiple bet sizing. So probably my favorite concept to talk about and think about right now. Since we will not usually have only 2 hand types in our betting range, so we won't usually just have a range of pure nuts and pure air, for example, we will often want to use multiple bet sizings in the same spot. Each range will need to be balanced and will consist of mostly hands which prefer to bet the sizing we're betting. So pause for a moment and think about this on the river because that's the easiest place to see it at first. On the river, we already just talked about how in theory we might want to have an overbetting range where we bet the pure nuts and the pure air because with just that range, that works perfectly. But we also are going to have a lot of hands that aren't pure nuts, and we're going to have a lot of air hands that don't remove the nutted hand in our opponent's range. Those hands probably can't bet as big. So let's say we just have some really, really good hands and some hands with some decent but not amazing removal effects. Maybe they want to bet smaller. Likewise, I'm actually going to scroll back to the last board texture, for example. Let's just do the jack of hearts, 10 of hearts, 4 of clubs, 2 of spades, 6 of hearts board. Maybe these hands right here, ace x of hearts and ace of hearts king x and ace of hearts queen x, work well in an overbetting range. We would still need to balance this because just based on a glance, we'd have way too many bluffs if we just jammed all of our ace x of hearts and all of our ace of hearts king x and ace of hearts queen x. So that would work well in an overbetting range, but we might want to bet smaller if we have weaker flushes. And we might want to bet smaller still if we have 2 pairs in sets. And we might want to bet smaller still if we have overpairs in top pair, top kicker. Each group of hands would prefer a different sizing, and now we need to make sure each one of those ranges are balanced. For example, we can't just have one of our bet sizing range capped at overpairs, because if we do, our opponent's going to be able to raise crazy aggressively because he knows he can raise all in whenever he has 2 pair or better. So we can't have a range capped at top pair, top kicker, or an overpair. So we need to balance that. But you can hopefully see at a glance how, okay, we have all these hands that kind of prefer a different sizing. So now we need to balance out a betting range for each one of those. So each one needs to have the right ratio of bluffs and might need to have some nutted hands to balance out the range as well. But you can see how picking one sizing on this river, on this jack of hearts, 10 of hearts, 4 of clubs, 2 of spades, 6 of hearts board, picking one sizing is not ideal. That's something a lot of people will do because they think, well, if I pick one sizing, my opponent won't know what I have. But if our ranges are all balanced, it doesn't really matter if, like, this range right here, ace of hearts, ace x of hearts, or ace of hearts, king x, it doesn't matter if I only can have 2 types of hands on the river. Those 2 types of hands work perfectly as an overbet jam. So even if our opponent has a good idea of what we have, as long as the range is balanced, he just can't do anything about it. So that's what multiple bet sizing is, and that's going to be the main focus of the next several videos, and it's quite difficult to do, but you'll also see as we do it on the flop, turn, and river, you'll also just see like what a huge deal it is. And a lot of the problems you probably have right now where you're like, ugh, I'm not sure if I should bet, I'm not sure if I should check, this is so tricky, you'd probably see, actually, it's not that tricky if you just bet really small. Or actually, it's not that tricky if you would have overbet the previous street, which is what you should have done. So, we're definitely going to focus on this a lot. It's difficult, but it's super interesting and super useful. This is impossible to perfect, and the level of detail in which you pursue multiple bet sizing will depend on your skill level. From what I've noticed, bad players will c-bet the same size in every spot regardless of the board texture. And when I say a bad player, I don't mean they can't be a big winner at really, really, really low stakes. I just mean overall, they've got a long ways to go in poker as they get better because you do not want to have a fixed c-bet sizing, which bad players tend to have. Mediocre players will adjust their c-bet sizing, but they usually bet their entire range based on the board texture. And when I say c-bet sizing, I mean on the flop, turn, and river as well. They aren't really going out of their way to see, okay, how much do I want to bet with this specific hand, and how do I balance out the range based on the turn, especially on the turn or the river. Great players will use multiple bet sizings in the same spot. So even in a turn situation, much less, or not only will they do this on the river, which is the easiest street, they'll also even do this on the turn or the flop. They will use multiple bet sizings in the same spot, and each of those ranges will be balanced. So even if you have a good idea of what's in that range, the range is balanced to the point where there's not much you can do about it. Very few players are that good where they're doing it, but it's definitely done. It is very reasonable to have a normal betting range and overbetting range after betting on a 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 5 of clubs flop and getting a 3 of spades turn. We don't want to only overbet here, yet overbetting here obviously is pretty awesome with some hands, say queen, queen, and some air. So that's just me illustrating the concept. You can see here, like, this is just a very normal turn spot. You probably get in this turn spot all the time, and there are some hands here that will want to overbet, like queen, queen. It's vulnerable, but queens are not beat on that turn. Honestly, if I have pocket queens there in most reasonable situations and my opponent called my flop bet and we got that turn, I'm probably going to be willing to stack off. So unless my opponent has some sort of, read that I can use based off his HUD, or based off my HUD, how is my pocket queens beat on that flop texture? He'd have to slow play a very strong hand on a very, very risky board texture. So with queens, I'm totally fine with overbetting there. Because it's a strong hand, it's a vulnerable hand. If my opponent has me beat, he has me beat. I expect to be beat almost never on that turn. But if I had a hand like queen 10, maybe I was sort of betting the flop kind of for value, kind of for protection. I can't make a huge overbet on the turn with queen 10 because then I'm not just effectively getting value. I'm owning myself when my opponent has pocket jacks, when he has ace 10, when he has king 10. Yet when I have queen 10, I also don't just want to give my opponent a bunch of free cards for the river, and I can still get value, so I'd want to bet smaller here. So that's just at a glance how you can see, oh, overbetting queens there makes sense. Betting small with queen 10 makes sense. I can very reasonably balance both of those ranges, and that's just using 2 bet sizing ranges on the turn. Not easy to do, but not impossible to do either. It's going to be, it can be as difficult as you want it to be blunt. This will be the main focus of future videos. Simply grasp the concept now. We are not having only 1 bet sizing in most spots. This does not just apply on the river. So that's just me repeating everything I already said, which I didn't realize was my last bullet point. So we will talk about this a lot more in future videos, and that's where I'm talking about how the next videos are probably going to be much more difficult than most of the videos I make. So just kind of go in with a mindset, which is how detailed do you want to go? How much do you want to focus on this right now? If you're just trying to grind up micro limits, this isn't something you need to be working really hard on. Whereas if you're actually already beating 1-2 for a lot, this is probably something that's worth thinking about. And now backing away from the tough stuff for a bit, how do we get the most money into the pot? So this is a question I ask people all the time, and they consistently get it wrong. What puts more money into the pot on average? Making a small bet the opponent must call at a high frequency, or a large bet the opponent must call at a low frequency. So, fundamentally, it really is that simple. Betting big makes the opponent call less, but put a lot of money into the pot. Betting small makes him call a whole bunch, but he doesn't put very much into the pot when he does call. Which, on average, gets more money into the pot? Think about it. Most people either don't know this, or when they guess, they get it wrong. And the answer is the large bet. How much money must the opponent put in at minimum to prevent us from being able to profitably bet any 2 cards when we bet 0.5 pot size bets? So depending on your skill level, you might want to do the math for this right now. How much money is the opponent putting in on at minimum when we bet 0.5 pot size bets if our opponent wants to prevent us from being able to profitably bet with any 2 cards? If you're not already super comfortable with the math, do it. The answer is our opponent needs to call 2/3 of the time because we're only risking half the pot. So because of that, our opponent needs to put in on average about 0.335 pot size bets. How about if we bet 1 pot size bet? Well, if we bet 1 to win 1, our opponent has to call half the time, and he puts in on average 0.5 pot size bets. How about 2 pot size bets? Well, he only has to call 1/3 of the time then, so 2 times 0.33 equals 0.6 pot size bets. Pause for a moment and think about this. Because a lot of times you're probably at the river, and your opponent realistically can't have a lot of your strong hands beat. Look at how much money your opponent has to put in on average when you bet 2 pot size bets compared to 0.5 pot size bets. A lot of people might think, oh, I want to bet small, because if I bet really, really big, my opponent might fold his entire range. That's fine if your range is way stronger than your opponent's on the river and you can use it exploitatively, but then you also probably should be overbet bluffing. Overall, your entire thought process needs to click and make sense, and you can see how if I'm playing against you, and if my range is more polarized than yours significantly on the river, you're probably not going to raise me when I bet almost ever, because you're going to say, well, why do I want to raise into a polarized range when I mostly have a bluff catcher? So you're not going to raise, and if I bet 2 pot size bets, this is how much money you need to put in order to prevent me from being able to profitably bluff my entire range. If I bet 0.5 pot size bets, which is what a lot of people do, you don't have to put in much money at all. So really just understand how important it is to use several sizings in the same spot and how big of an impact your bet sizing has on how much money your opponent has to put into the pot. And since this video is about laying down the foundation for future videos, I have a teaser, which is, suppose you are debating making a 2 pot size bet jam on the river or betting 0.5 pot size bets with the nuts. So you have the nuts on the river and you're thinking, do I want to bet 2 pot size bets and go all in, or would I rather bet 0.5 pot size bets because my opponent may raise me? How often must your opponent raise your 0.5 pot size bet to get the same EV as a 2 pot size bet jam? Ignore removal effects and just assume if he raises, he's going all in, which will almost always be the case. So now think about this for a second. If your opponent's never going to raise you, like I just talked about sort of in this example up here, where we wanted to look at what's the minimum amount of money the opponent must put into the pot, because my opponent's never really going to raise me since my range is more polarized than him. You can look to see how much money he has to put in up here, but other times we might have a range that has some nutted hands, and our opponent has some nutted hands in his range. So if we bet really small, our opponent might value raise worst or bluff raise. So maybe betting small with the nuts is actually more profitable than jamming the nuts, because our opponent will raise us sometimes. That's a very important thing to understand, because I'm not by any means saying we should always have an overbetting range on the river, which is pure nuts and pure air. That's not the case at all. It doesn't I can understand why people might think that makes sense, but you'll see mathematically how that won't always work. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. So think here, and this is a good math problem to do, how much does your opponent need to raise you to make betting small with the nuts better than betting big with the nuts? This is key for balancing ranges. If you are not jamming the nuts on the river, you are saying your opponent must raise your river bet frequently enough to make betting small more plus EV than jamming. Removal effects could be very relevant here, and getting the perfect sizing down can be very tricky, but chances are you aren't overbetting nearly enough. So just think about this for future videos. I'd really recommend doing the math for it. Even if you can't do it, it gets your brain thinking the right way, and you learn from your mistakes, but we will definitely talk about this a lot in future videos. And especially when dealing with multiple bet sizing, removal effects are usually a really big deal on the river, not so much on other streets. So, now let's move on to dealing with less polarized ranges. On the flop and the turn, you're almost never going to have a perfectly polarized range. No shocker there. Ranges get more polarized as we advance to the next street in general. Pre-flop, we don't even need nutted hands in our calling range. Tons of weak hands, like all those that I listed, become the nuts by the river, and tons of strong hands, ace, king, or queens, will become weak by the river. So think about that. Pre-flop, you're waiting to see the flop, turn, and river, so there aren't really any hands that are guaranteed to be strong by the river, and there's a whole bunch of hands that start off weak and become very, very, very strong. So if you have, for example, ace, king, or queens, which are both premium hands, by the river, one of those is usually going to be pretty weak. If an ace or a king comes, queens aren't very good. If no ace or king comes, ace, king's not very good. Flop. It depends on the flop texture, but hard to have a hand that can't be outdrawn reasonably often. There are some flop textures where you can kind of have a very, very polarized range. Like, it might be on like a 2-2-8 flop or something like that. But for the most part, it doesn't happen all that often. So, even a hand like 9-8 of diamonds has over 10% equity versus aces on a queen 7-2 rainbow board. That's so incredibly substantial, especially since the equity with 9 of diamonds, 8 of diamonds, we're going to know whether or not we turned a 10 or a 9 or an 8 or a 6 or a diamond on the turn. So this 10% equity is so incredibly significant here. And when you look at this at a glance, especially if you're very new to poker, you think aces is just nutted when you see aces against 9-8 of diamonds on a queen 7-2 rainbow board. Like, I can only imagine what would happen if you were playing live and you outdrew aces by floating them with 9 of diamonds, 8 of diamonds on the flop. And it's a very standard float. It depends on ranges, depends on position, all that stuff, but it's a very reasonable hand to float. I imagine you're usually going to call it. People would probably freak out because they think it's so incredibly rare. It's not rare at all. Turn. Fewer hands have the potential to outdraw strong hands. Many are drawing dead, but often hands will have 18 to 19% equity if they have open-ended straight draws or flush draws. So it's very important to look at the turn board texture, because a lot of times you'll have just a ton of hands drawing dead or really reasonable draws. 9 of diamonds has 18 to 19%, has 18 to 19% equity on a 6 of spades or 3 diamonds turn, but 0% equity on other turns. So the turn, you're going to have a lot of sort of really good hands to bluff with, and you're also going to have just a lot of your hands go to complete air. The river hands have either 100% or 0% equity against the opponent's hand, though not against his range. This is very significant for bet sizing, as we've already talked about. Why can't you bet 20% of the pot on some rivers when you are out of position? After all, it does not reopen up the betting. So think about this for a minute, and I just ninja edited my bad sentence, but think about this for a minute. Why can't you bet 20% of the pot when you're out of position on the river? When you're in position on the river, I can see why people won't usually want to bet 20% of the pot, because when you bet that small, you're only going to get a tiny bit of value, and you might be very vulnerable to being check raised. And if you're not very vulnerable to being check raised, why would you be betting that small, right? Because then you have the polarized range and you can bet bigger. So I get why in position you wouldn't want to bet 20% of the pot very often on the river, but why wouldn't you do it out of position on the river? Because you're not reopening up the betting. Pause for a moment and think about it. Because I imagine if you're 99% of players, you're not used to seeing someone bet 20% of the pot out of position on the river, and you're probably not doing it yourself. Why does it not work? And spoiler alert, you can, nay, you should be doing this, and probably a lot more often than you think. In reality, only a few people do this, since most people don't understand why this makes sense, much less how to apply it. So hopefully now, after this video, you're starting to get the idea of, oh wow, I'm awful at bet sizing. That's not meant to insult you, it's just, if you already were pretty decent at poker, you probably were just used to winning playing by the same rules everyone else uses, and now when you're seeing all this stuff, you're like, okay, I get why betting 20% of the pot out of position makes sense, even though it doesn't maybe make as much sense in position, even though I never do it and I never see it. So as long as you're starting to just grasp the concepts now, we'll be able to start applying it later, because obviously we can't apply it until we understand it, but the need to apply it is also something that's somewhat difficult. It's not just you can grasp the concept of 3-betting pre-flop and then sort of memorize a chart of, oh, these are my good 3-bet bluffs based on position. This is harder to do. So just start thinking about it now. We are going to get into why you would bet the river very small out of position, and it will happen reasonably often, and it is a reasonable impact on your EV for the hand. Now I want to mention why you should not overreact to trying to make hands indifferent. When people are first learning theory, they often think they need to pinpoint some hands in the opponent's range and make them indifferent to calling or folding. This is an extremely common question I get asked, either through PM or on the forums or wherever. There's often no reason to think you need to pick a bet sizing that makes a certain group of hands in your opponent's range indifferent to calling. That's not what you're doing when you're making a bet. A lot of times that will happen, but that's not your goal. Common statement I'm asked, what sizing do I need to use to make my opponent indifferent to calling with a flush draw on the turn? Well, why is there an indifference point here? The opponent probably can make plus EV calls with some flush draws, but not others. Also, what is the big deal if the opponent can make a plus 1.1 in EV call with his flush draws? This is what I mean by this. What is so significant about making your opponent indifferent with a group of hands? Because you might find that even if you don't make your opponent indifferent, his EV isn't 0, you might make his EV only plus 1 BB in EV when the pot's already 20 big blinds. So, for example, if I pick my turn sizing and there's a flush draw on the turn, I might have to bet really, really, really big to make my opponent fold all of his flush draws. But what if I just made a reasonable bet size that just makes his flush draws, some will still probably have to fold, but it makes the flush draws that he can call with only slightly profitable. That's probably overall much better for my range or much better for my hand, because I'm not just trying to make my opponent indifferent to calling with his flush draws. That's not my goal when I'm betting the turn. My goal is to maximize my EV by betting the turn, and my opponent's flush draws only make up a smallish fraction of his range. So people often think there's this huge jump between making the opponent's call with a flush draw 0 EV or plus 1 BB in EV, and there really isn't. One makes the opponent, have to, whether he calls or folds, he wins 0 BB. The other makes him win 1 BB. That's only a 1 BB difference. That's not a big deal. So you can all the times bet, even though your opponent has a profitable call, because when your opponent has to call the bet, it's only slightly profitable. So just really make sure you understand that. Even if your opponent can profitably call your turn bet, if you make your sizing reasonable, a lot of times he's going to be calling with hands which are like, ugh, I've already invested a lot of money in the pot. I'm not happy about having to call here. I do think the call is slightly profitable, and even though I'm winning money at this point, overall I'm losing a lot of money for the hand. So my call might be plus 1 or 2 big blinds in EV, but overall I'm losing a lot of money for the hand. I'm very unhappy here. That's obviously a much better situation to put your opponent in than just checking and letting him make an extremely profitable check back. So don't assign more value to making hands indifferent than should be there. On most board textures, you can't bet too big because the opponent has some nutted hands in his range. Making flush draws and straight draws fold might sound great, but this may require us to make very large bets, which makes the opponent's folding range very strong and makes us hate life when we get raised. So again, I'm sorry if this is very obvious to you because you already play decent stakes and make decent money, but all the time you see people focus their bet sizing on making draws indifferent to calling. There's almost no reason to ever do that. It is not a big deal if the opponent can make a slightly profitable call with his draws. Do not focus on this. You are assigning an equilibrium point that does not exist. Sure, we can bet big if our opponent's range is capped and he has many hands in his range which can outdraw us. But how often does your opponent have hands with a lot of equity in his range and have an uncapped range? Not very often that your opponent's going to have a range that has a bunch of hands with a ton of equity, and his range is also uncapped so you can overbet. Usually, if the opponent doesn't have many strong hands, you're not all that vulnerable. And if he does have a lot of hands that can outdraw you, he also often have a lot of nutted hands. There are exceptions to this, and we're often going to want to overbet in these spots, but for the most part, we are going to be restricted on how big we can bet. Otherwise, we're going to just run into the nuts too much. Our job is always to pick the bet sizing, which is most plus EV. It is never to pick a bet sizing which makes our opponent indifferent with the most hands in his range. We want the most profitable line. Sometimes a byproduct of that is making the opponent indifferent or close to indifferent with a lot of hands, but that's not our goal. Descending bet sizing makes sense with vulnerable hands. Descending bet sizing means we bet bigger on earlier streets relative to the size of the pot and smaller on later streets. This allows us to manipulate the opponent's range to make high equity hands fold earlier on. I did not understand this well when I made the first series. This is very, very similar to the way we decide to bet the earlier streets rather than later streets when we have a marginally strong, vulnerable hands. You've seen this a lot if you watch my other videos. A lot of what I really focus on is if you have a hand that wants to get only 1 or 2 streets of value, you want to figure out, do you want to check flop, bet turn, and bet river, or do you want to bet flop and turn and check river? That's largely based on how vulnerable your hand is. If I open the button and the flop comes King of Hearts, 7 of Spades, 4 of Spades, I will probably bet flop plus turn with 8-8 and check back the flop to bet turn plus river with King of Diamonds, 3 of Diamonds. Why? So assume the big blind calls here and think about this for a second. Why am I betting with 8s on the flop and the turn, and I'm betting on the turn and the river and checking the flop with King 3? Both hands want to get sort of 2 streets for value. How do I decide which streets I bet? We can use the exact same concept of betting not only the earlier streets, but betting bigger when we have a strong and vulnerable hand. So that's exactly what I was doing with the 8s, as I'm sure most of you realized immediately. 8s are kind of vulnerable. If I bet 8s on the King 7-4 board and I make my opponent fold 9-10, cool. If I bet King 3 on the King 7-4 board and I make my opponent fold 9-10, it didn't really matter because 9-10 is not that likely to outdraw me anyways. So, with the more vulnerable hands, emphasize betting earlier streets because you can make your opponent fold higher equity hands. And when I say high equity, I mean relative to the hand we have. So when we bet 8s on the flop, we make our opponent fold high equity hands. When we bet King 3 on the flop, we don't really make our opponent fold any high equity hands relative to our hand because the hands that King 3 is vulnerable against are going to be like flush draws and straight draws, which aren't going anywhere. So we're just using this exact same concept with bet sizing. If we bet bigger, we make our opponent fold more stuff. Cool. Let's continue with the 8-8 example. Here are my thoughts on this board. On the flop, I am fine with getting hands like Jack 10, Queen 10, and Ace 9 suited to fold, so betting slightly bigger to make these hands fold at a higher frequency seems good. On the turn, I will either bet smaller since the opponent's implied odds decreased if the turn is very good for my hand, or check back if the turn sucked. I don't want to bet so big that I make my opponent fold 7x. This requires math and sizing that I don't even have memorized, as I am basically just a poker theoryologist now, but we'll look into it later on when we take a more analytical approach, which will come towards the end of this series. So bet sizing is something that I'm going to be doing a lot of talking about for a long time, but at the end of the series, that's when we take the much more analytical approach, and we'll get into this. So now let's just think about this once more. So if we have 8s, how much equity do overcards have against our 8s on the flop? Like 25-ish, maybe a little bit more percent equity. So making 25% equity hands fold with 8s on the flop is a big deal, so we can bet a little bit bigger to make our opponent fold overcards a little bit more often. Whereas if the turn came a 2 of diamonds, so imagine the board again, king of hearts, 7 of spades, 4 of spades, 2 of diamonds. Now when I have 8s on the turn, I'm kind of thinking to myself, your overcards just don't have that much equity now. Your equity was more or less cut in half. So now if I have 8s on the turn, I can say, you know what, I'm just going to bet small with 8s on the turn. It'll let me check back the river. Maybe I'll even want to bet super small on the river, but we don't need to get into that. But I'm going to bet smaller with 8s on the turn, because now I want to just manipulate your range in just the right way, so you have to call down with all of your 7s, and even if you call down with your overcards, you're not getting that good a price, because if you call the turn with your overcards, your implied odds your equity is way lower, so you're going to outdraw me much less often. So you can see how betting a little bit bigger with 8s on the flop and a little bit smaller with 8s on the turn is probably better than betting an equal fraction on both the flop and the turn, because we want to make the high equity hands fold quicker, so betting bigger on the flop accomplishes that more effectively. And we still are restricted with our bet sizing, because if we bet too big, we're just going to get called by kings and we're going to make 7s fold, which is the exact opposite of what we want to do. Now, as for actually pinpointing the sizing, this isn't really that difficult. I mean, it's not that difficult to bring up Flopzilla, see what sizing you use is going to make him call down different hands on the turn. Not that hard of a problem, but it is something that I don't have memorized right now, because it's just, I don't need to memorize exactly what size to bet on every single board texture. The better you are, the more important that is. So maybe you're at a skill level where you actually do want to memorize all these different sizings, but for the most part, I would just want to get comfortable with seeing, okay, with 8s here, I can bet bigger on the flop and then smaller on the turn cards that are good for 8s. Then if I got a bad turn card for 8s, I would just check back. Descending bet sizing continued. Let's do another example. We'll do many more of these later, but let's make sure we grasp the concept well before moving on. Suppose we have ace-8 in the button versus the big blind on a 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 4 of clubs board. If we want to bet 1 or 2 streets on this board texture, when do we bet them? Pause for a moment and think, but it's really obvious. On the flop. Giving a free card is risky, so let's bet now to make high equity hands relative to our hand, fold. So remember, whenever we're talking about high equity hands, we mean relative to our hand. It's very confusing to get like a range in your specific hand confused, and you really have to understand both what your range is doing and what your specific hand is doing at the same time. So here, obviously, this is going to be a board that's kind of hard for our opponent to check raise us, although he can definitely do it. We have a lot of strong hands that are betting this flop, so it makes sense to put it in the betting range, and then our specific hand is very vulnerable, so we're really encouraged to bet this flop rather than check back. So what does this say about the polarization of our betting range? Now pause for a moment and think. So polarization, does this mean our betting range is going to be mostly nuts and air? Does this mean our betting range is going to have a lot of medium strength hands in our range? Well, if we're betting ace-8, we don't have a very polarized range because we're betting now hands that only want to get 1 or 2 streets for value. Give that a moment to sink in. On other board textures, we might not have many hands that are only betting for 1 or 2 streets of value. Here, we clearly do, because we have hands that can get value by betting, like 8x, that also hate giving free cards, like 8x. So because of that, our betting range is less polarized here, because we want to bet early on to make high equity hands fold. So since our betting range is less polarized, because we're more likely to bet earlier streets than later streets with hands that want 2 streets of value, what does this mean our opponent should do? So let's look. Follow the logic through. Should our opponent mostly check raise now or delay it to a later street? Well, the opponent is probably going to want to check raise now. Giving our betting range free cards is very risky, and we may be betting hands for a single street of value and will plan on checking back the turn on many turn cards. This makes his delayed check raise whiff, as well as makes it reasonably likely that if he has a hand like pocket fours, he can just get outdrawn on. So, because we're betting this flop with a lot of hands that only want to bet 1 or 2 streets for value, our betting range is kind of wide, and it's not polarized, and since our betting range is not very polarized, it makes a check raise more effective against us. Because now he really makes us go, ugh, when we face a check raise with all these medium strength hands. So, what sizing should we use if we are betting on this flop? What sizing seems reasonable? Well, bigger on the flop and smaller on the turn looks good to me. We can also just check back if the turn comes a queen after all. It's not like we won't see when our opponent has likely improved. So remember, when we bet ace-8 on the flop and we can make our opponent fold some overcards, that's really good. Maybe on this board texture, it might be harder to make overcards fold because a lot of them have gut shots, but in general, it makes sense to bet bigger on the earlier street when we have a vulnerable hand because we can deny our opponent his ability to realize his equity. That's going back to the whole not all equity is created equally thing. If we can deny our opponent the ability to realize his equity, it's huge, and a lot of times we have hands and ranges that allow us to really deny our opponent from being able to effectively realize his equity. So hopefully you're not completely out of adrenaline from the rush which was descending bet sizing, because now we're ready to talk about ascending bet sizing. Oftentimes we'll start out betting smaller fractions of the pot and end up betting bigger fractions of the pot later on. Why? What do bigger bets mean? Well, as we've already explained, bigger bets mean our betting range has become more polarized, right? Doesn't make sense to have a big betting range unless that range is very polarized. Remember, this is always relative to the opponent's range. If our range is more polarized, our opponent's is more condensed. You can't have one without the other. That's something that's easy to kind of forget. But if I'm saying my range is polarized, I'm saying my opponent's range is condensed because it's relative to my range. If I'm saying, you know what, when I value bet the flop here, my hands have less equity than they usually do. They only have, maybe my value betting hands only have 75% equity. Then that's also sort of the same way as me saying my opponent's floats have more equity than they usually do because they're more likely to outdraw my value betting hands. So you maybe could find an exception to what I just said, but for the most part, if my value betting hands don't have a lot of equity, my opponent's floats probably have a lot of equity. They're relative to one another. This makes sense in many situations where we started out betting smaller since our opponent may have had us beat, or we wanted him to value raise our bluff raise if we had the near nuts. We'll talk about that later. Yes, yet since our opponent only called our bet, we now don't think our opponent can have us beat and can begin betting larger without fearing running into a stronger hand. So we've already talked about this a bit, but if the opponent's called us on a very scary board and the turn card blanks, this is going to be the most common spot where you overbet. Your opponent calls you on a very wet board, the next card blanks, then you can probably safely say, hey, I don't think he's going to have my good hands beat almost ever, because if he had them beat, he'd have to have taken a very, very big risk by slow playing on the previous street, and that allows us to overbet. So very common situation, very important. We already talked about it a lot, though, so we'll move on. How does our range get polarized? Our range gets polarized when we get a favorable turn or river card that misses the opponent's range after he mostly raised his strong or weak hands when facing a bet on a previous street. So that after he already raised his strong or weak hands when facing a bet on the previous street is extremely important here. If the opponent didn't just raise most of his good hands, we might not be able to overbet. The opponent has a very hard time slow playing on wet flops and turns even if he knows we can overbet. I'm sorry, I should have yelled that. I guess I put an exclamation mark in it when I was writing it. If the opponent does not think we will overbet, he is probably slow playing at an extremely low frequency or not at all. I'm not going to use exclamation marks again. It's annoying. Okay, so one of the cool things about overbetting is even if your opponent knows you're overbetting, his sort of defense against it kind of sucks. Like, it sucks either way, because if he wants to defend against it, he has to slow play, which is incredibly, incredibly risky. So, in reality, most people aren't overbetting enough. Your opponent's going to be slow playing even less than he should be in theory. Even in theory, he's not going to want to slow play wet boards very often because there's just huge, huge drawbacks to slow playing on wet boards. But especially in practice, I'm talking mostly from my experience at No Limit 200, especially in practice, your opponent's just not going to slow play almost at all because he's not used to facing overbets, and even if he faces an overbet once in an extremely blue moon, he's got to have to face it all the time to justify the risk of slow playing. I just about never recommend someone slow plays a big hand on a risky board texture without a really, really good read. So likewise, if people aren't gonna overbet against us, I'm not really gonna slow play any super strong hands because it's just too risky. It's also easy to forget that when you're slow playing, you also may lose value when the turn in the river scares us and the opponent, even if we still have the best hand. So the turn the turn of the river might actually not make us lose, but it might just make us lose value because maybe the river card brought a flush, and on the turn we had a set and our opponent had two pair, so now when he bets the river, we just call. So that's always a risk, and we also may just get drawn out on, which is the biggest risk, because gut shots just straight up happen all the time. It's not rare at all. Examples of polarized ranges. We are playing against each other. I open the cutoff and you flat on the button. The flop comes 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 4 clubs, and I continuation bet, you call. What turn cards can I overbet where your range is capped at just jacks and ace-10 suited? Alright, so let's go through the turn cards we could probably overbet. So first, let's start with an ace. An ace might be a little bit difficult depending on how many 2 pairs the opponent gets, right? Like if the opponent's flatting with ace-10 off, which he probably is, the turn's probably going to be very difficult to overbet. Whenever I talk about any of these cards, we of course can't overbet a heart because that puts a bunch of flushes in the opponent's range, so overbetting's probably not going to be all that effective. So let's do so ace probably I don't think would work all that well. A king to me would probably work pretty well. The opponent, like if the turn comes like king of diamonds, the opponent can probably have 2 combinations of king 10 suited. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with rarely running into king 10 suited. No big deal. He probably can't have any or many ace king. So the king actually looks like a decent turn card to overbet with a range. How about a queen of diamonds? Well, the queen of diamonds got jack 9 of diamonds, or jack 9 suited there, and queen 10 suited there, so it's probably not a great turn card to overbet. Not the end of the world either. The jack probably would be decent, because with the jack, you're going to be able to your opponent's not really going to have jack 10 suited, I think. I don't think most people flat with 9-7 suited here. That might be something useful to look at your opponent's stats, see if you think he calls with it, but I think a lot of people are going to fold 9-7 suited, cut off for button, so look at his cold call frequency to figure that out. But jack 10 suited looks decent because the opponent can once again only have really 2 combos, and then if he has pocket jacks, then that would be 3 more for 5 combos. So a reasonable turn card to consider overbetting on, but probably not the best or the worst. It depends on, as I said, whether or not he can have 9-7 suited or pocket jacks. 10 would not be a good card to overbet on. The removal effects are not good for it. It just won't work. 9 would be terrible because Queen Jack gets the straight and that makes up a bunch of combos. Same with 10-9 suited. So Queen Jack will be about, Queen Jack suited will be 4 combos. If you can have the offsuit, then that's a bunch. And even just 8-9 suited and 10-9 suited make it probably not ideal. 8s also probably aren't going to be the greatest because your opponent's just going to have trips. And then here's going to be the best turn cards to overbet. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2. Your opponent might be able to have some strong hands on some of these turns. Like, for example, if the turn was a 7, maybe you can have 6-5 suited. 6-5 suited likely would have bluff raised the flop, though, to be honest. So any 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, or 2, not of a heart, is probably going to be a really, really good turn card to overbet. And remember, when you're overbetting, it doesn't mean you have to never be able to be beat. It just means you probably shouldn't be beat at a very high frequency. So going back to example for the jack, maybe overbetting ace-jack on the turn will be kind of good because we block our opponent's pocket jacks. Yeah, maybe overbetting pocket queens wouldn't be as good because our opponent can have pocket jacks. How detailed you want to go into that is up to you. It's something that's reasonable to think about if you're like an incredibly sick player, but if you're a mere mortal, you're probably just thinking, okay, well, when the jack gets there, 3 combos of pocket jacks, 2 combos of jack 10 suited, and then maybe the 9-7 suited. It might not be the best spot to overbet. It's probably not very good. So think about all that stuff when you're playing, but at least these lower non-heart cards are going to make very good overbet spots. So now my next question to you is, why don't you overbet regularly in this spot? And I'm guessing over 97% of people that watch this video don't. Why don't you overbet regularly this spot with a balanced range on the turn in this situation? The situation is neither rare nor complex, so why are you not overbetting on those good turn cards? They're not hard to identify. It's not a complex spot, and it actually happens all the time. Is it because you don't know how your opponents will respond? Because if that's the case, why not just go figure it out? Why not just start overbetting there with some of the right hands, and you might find out if your opponents respond well, there's still not a lot they can do about it, and if they respond poorly, maybe they fold way too much, maybe they fold way too little, then you can exploit them like crazy. Is it because you are lazy and would rather autopilot and win playing slightly better than everyone else without thinking? That's something very reasonable to consider. You might be playing too many tables, and you might just honestly be kind of lazy or kind of scared about taking this new approach to your game, which is much more difficult, and at the end of the day, you're not going to have a ton of people to talk about with this kind of stuff, because now you're starting to approach a skill level where most people aren't at. And obviously there's many aspects of your game, so maybe you just get much better at bet sizing than other people, but you're kind of in more of an uncharted territory, which makes it a little bit more difficult. So figure out why you're not overbetting in these spots, because a lot of benefiting from these videos is going to be you have to force yourself to really make sure there's no contradictions in your thought process, and you can't be afraid to do stuff that other people haven't been telling you to do your entire poker career. It is okay to have a capped range as long as it is pretty uncommon and or your opponent won't own you for it. If you are very, very likely to be capped and get owned for it, you are likely but not always doing something wrong. So one problem people tend to have a lot with poker theory, and I get asked this in PM a lot, is like, a question here would be, how capped is too capped? You don't want to use a label if it's not very helpful. You don't want to like assign sort of all or nothing logic. A range there can be different degrees of how capped a range is, and how bad being capped is going to depend on, how many streets are left to act, how much stack depth is there, how much equity does your opponent's air hand have against your capped range. All those variables are very, very important. So don't get in the mindset of sort of just assigning a range as either capped or non-capped, because there are different levels of it. For example, on the 10 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 4 of clubs board, maybe your opponent's range is going to be the most capped on a 2 of diamonds turn, but the opponent maybe can still slow play some really strong hands on the flop. If he is slow playing some really strong hands on the flop, having said that, you probably can still overbet the 2 of diamonds turn because it put no strong hands in his range on the turn. So just because the opponent's, has some sets on the turn, his range is for the most part capped. I'm okay with overbetting queens on the turn if I'm only going to run into, a few combinations of pocket fours. No big deal. My opponent was going to stack me when he had pocket fours anyways. So don't use labels and stuff unless they help you, and just be very careful not to assign sort of all or nothing logic. We're getting into sort of the hard stuff here, and you have to understand how many different theoretical concepts relate to one another in order to make this stuff useful. Cliffs. If your opponent calls your flop bet on a very dry board and the turn blinks, he probably has a capped range, and overbetting some of your range is likely, but not always, going to theoretically make sense. End of the first video. I wanted to get through more material, but we'll have to save it for the second video. It is very hard to understand these concepts without understanding other important concepts as well, so this video took me a bit longer than I wanted. I'm hoping in the next, in the first 15 or 10 minutes of the second video, we could finish up sort of giving a quick overview of what's going to be in this series, and then we can jump into more detail. But I think it's important that you understand it relatively well the first time, and we did sort of already talk about multiple bet sizing in a little more detail than I thought, so that does give you something to think about for the next video, how you can pick multiple sizings on the turn in the river, because that's mostly what we're going to be focused on later on in the future videos, which is here, we're at this spot, we have this complex range, how do we put all the hands in our range into all these neat little, bet sizing ranges. So, look forward to that hopefully, and we'll start that in the next video. You should hopefully have a good idea of where the series is going now, so that when we jump in with more detail, you will not be confused. If you are confused now, ask and I'll try to help in the forums. So this is the organic chemistry of theory videos. In other words, if you don't understand the previous stuff I've talked about, both in this video and other videos, you are not going to understand the next video as well at all. So if you are confused now, let me know. It's one of those things that builds on itself. It's not one of those things where you can just jump in and be like, okay, I have, for the most part, a good idea of what's going on. So if you are lost, let me know in the forums and I'll try to help you. Thank you for watching and good luck at the tables. So, good luck everyone. I'll see you later. Bye.